welcome to the webinar today, everybody. This is part one in a two-part series that's inspired by some recent research that we've done here at WANI in unison with Wakefield, which is what the focus of this first webinar is going to be today. And it's really focused around employee surveillance technology and what IT experts really think about it. So we'll start with some introductions, ideally. There we go. So my name's Hannah. As my bio here says, I'm Senior Content Manager here at WANI. And really does what it says on the tin. I focus on all things content. And as you can imagine, I've been very much involved in research and the writing of the report and getting involved and understanding this new trend. So I'm very excited to be talking to you all about it today. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Next, we have Nathan, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, and thank you, Hannah. My name is Nathan Richter. I'm Senior Partner over here at Wakefield Research, overseeing our thought leadership division. There's plenty of nice things said about me here, but just a little background on Wakefield. We are a research consultancy working with 50 of the Fortune 100, working in over 90 countries. And we're just very pleased to be here with you guys today to talk to you a little bit about surveillance in the workplace.
We're very pleased to have you because you guys are the experts in all the data that we've got here. And I thank you for that little introduction there into Wakefield too. Hopefully everybody on the call today knows, but for anyone that doesn't, WANI, we like to call ourselves the original DEX company, and we're very much focused on digital employee experience and helping IT teams improve end user experience, tighten security, reduce costs, and involve operations from cost center to strategic enabler. But hey, you can look into that some more if you're interested in WANI. So I mentioned before, we are doing this off the back of some new research that we've been doing. If you're interested, well, I like to think everybody here has already read the research, but if you haven't, then you can just scan this code here, download it nice and easy. It'll take you straight through to a landing page, and then you can get stuck into that. We will put the code up again at the end, so if you miss it this time around, don't worry. Now, the focus of the webinar today, we're really going to be looking at the jumping off point, which is introducing EPST, or employee productivity surveillance technology. That's a tongue twister. And we want to look at what it is, why we focus the research on it, some of our findings, and what questions really need to be answered when it comes to this kind of technology. So start from the beginning, a definition of what EPST is and what we went out to the audiences that we surveyed with. This is their understanding of it. So EPST, or employee productivity surveillance technology, it really refers to a range of tools that companies use to monitor productivity for employees. Some of them you may be familiar with, some of them you may not have seen at all. You know, that could be anything from tools such as monitoring web activity, logging time spent using various platforms, key logging and click logging, video recording and audio recording. So full end of the spectrum there. Now, when it came to the research, we wanted to take a slightly different approach. We took a look at what the market had done so far, and the research and reporting patterns that we saw focused on these areas. So the growth and prevalence of EPST, employer motivations and beliefs. So, you know, why were organizations bringing this technology in? The behaviors and feelings of the employees who were being monitored. So, you know, the leaders have brought it in. How do those being surveilled feel about it? And then finally, here we have the ethics and law surrounding it. You'll notice that there's a lot of publications around this area, especially now that it's becoming very prevalent. Now, in terms of our research and the perspective we wanted to take, we noticed that no one was really giving any thought to those teams that have to implement the software. We looked at, you know, why someone might bring it into the company and their thoughts, how the person being watched might be feeling. But what about that middleman? And this is where we land on IT teams, IT managers, IT workers, and their perspectives. So here you'll see some of the questions that we really wanted to consider when it came to the research. You know, what are the hidden costs around deploying EPST? What are the negative impacts that EPST could have for, you know, workers and IT managers, and what have they seen happening within organizations? Are these workers going to push back on it? And how do they feel about having that technology turned on themselves and really being the ones under the surveillance camera, so to speak? So I'll hand over to Nathan here. You're the expert on the methodology. I'm the expert on all the waffle around it. So let me hand over to you, and I'm sure you're going to give us a good breakdown on that.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. And again, thank you to 1E for the chance to be here today, and for all of you for participating and your interest in learning more about this research and this topic. And it is an incredibly important issue. At Wakefield, because of the type of work we're doing, we are exploring all manner of topics in people's personal lives, in the workplace, and certainly those related to workplace productivity, and all against recently the backdrop of the massive changes we've all experienced in work life over the last several years. But this research, I feel, in particular, is timely, and it's an appropriate moment to be exploring this topic. We're seeing so many companies struggle with productivity and how to measure it, how to encourage it, and perhaps how to enforce it. And so, as Hannah, as you mentioned, as we began our work with 1E, we had some objectives for the research here that I just want to cover with you very briefly. First, we wanted to take a look at how workplace productivity surveillance affects the team charged with implementing it, so the IT department specifically. Secondly, we're going to take a look about sort of what actions, if any, the IT team would take if their company decided to install this technology, or maybe more aggressive elements of this technology. What kind of friction arises internally? And finally, probably a better understanding of the consequences for companies as they choose to implement these technologies. And so this is, as I said, incredibly important stuff. As such, it deserves a robust methodology, and we have that here. So just a quick reminder of who we're surveying. This is research conducted amongst 500 full-time IT workers and 500 full-time IT managers at companies with 500 or more employees. So 500, 500, 500 is sort of the takeaway here. What that means is that this is methodologically rigorous opinion research work, that the results that we're going to review can be projected onto the larger population of workers and managers at companies of these types. So it's important research. It's research that we would consider to be decision grade. Without further ado, why don't we jump into the first data slide here, and let's talk about some data. So we begin by kind of broadening the aperture and looking at just how common EPST is. And here you get a good look at that. 83% of IT managers and 77% of IT workers' current company uses some form of this technology. That is quite candidly a large number. And that number increases if we look at those with experience with this technology, either in their current workplace or at a prior employer. That figure actually jumps to 89% of managers and 84% of workers have experience with this technology. And it speaks to really how widespread the use of this technology already is. But as ubiquitous as this technology has become, it's going to only grow in prevalence. It is proliferating at a relatively rapid rate. When you ask IT managers and IT workers at companies that aren't currently using productivity surveillance technologies, most of those workers, so 79%, believe it's likely that their company will begin using this technology in the next 3 years. And among those, 50% say it's very or extremely likely. So, the takeaway here is that this technology is already everywhere, and those that aren't using it today very likely will be using it tomorrow. As we get into our next slide, we explore how managers and IT workers are feeling about this. So this thing is everywhere, and what's the emotion associated with that? And what we find is that it's quite concerning for the IT department. And what's really driving some of that concern, some of the alarm associated with this, is that we see a disconnect between IT management and IT workers and their sentiments. Managers greatly underestimate how uneasy deploying EPST makes their staff. Only 8% of managers think their staff would be uncomfortable with being asked to deploy productivity surveillance technology. So only 8% think the staff would have an issue with this. But when you ask IT workers about how they would feel deploying this technology and monitoring colleagues, the majority, 54%, would be uncomfortable. So that is a delta. That's a gap that I'm quite honest, you could drive a whole fleet of buses through. That is a very large gap. And what it tells us is that managers are not truly attuned to their team's feelings on this matter, and that they are overestimating their willingness to use EPST to monitor their colleagues. So moving to the next slide, we can take a look at why it makes them uncomfortable. We asked workers and managers, first, if it's appropriate for companies to monitor what employees are really doing while they work, or is it an invasion of privacy? Under what circumstances, if any, should it be done? And first off, right off the bat, about a third of both workers and managers, so 31%, 33%, believe this technology is an invasion of employees' privacy and should not be used under any circumstances. That is a very strong statement to make. Under any circumstances is a very bright red line. Particularly in a field like mine, in opinion research, you tend to give folks all kinds of options for how to answer a question. Likely, maybe, probably, sometimes. Here we have people saying no, under no circumstances is this something I agree with. So to put even more of a dramatic light on it, for nearly half of workers, 46%, deploying productivity surveillance technology that monitors their colleagues would cause them greater anxiety than being monitored by that technology themselves. So the implication there essentially is they're saying, I would feel more worried about having to monitor my colleagues than my company monitoring me. So there's, to me, there suggests there's potentially some ethical dilemmas here that folks are wrestling with. That said, the research, does show some different facets of this issue. It's fair to ask the question, what about the 69% of workers or the 67% of managers who believe it's okay for companies to monitor employees while they work? To that, I would say, well, not so fast. That's not the whole story, because the data reveals a really important nuance here. It shows that even if the IT department believes it is within the company's right to monitor employees, it still causes the team uneasiness to implement some of that technology. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the next slide here, and I can show you exactly what that looks like. So as we know, as you see, there are many different types of surveillance technology. As you can see in this chart, IT workers' comfort tends to vary depending on the type of technology used. Now, the two types of surveillance they're most comfortable with are those that are a little bit more conventional methods, right? Monitoring web activity and logging time spent using various programs. Those tend to be some of the more traditional methods. They've been around a little bit longer. I think that you're probably seeing a case there of frequency and lending itself a little bit more to comfort, their comfort levels. Just sort of familiarity breeds comfort. But very quickly, we start to see areas where a majority are uncomfortable with surveillance tech. And these are things like key logging and click logging and video recording. And as we start looking into that more closely, we see that nearly 2/3 are very uncomfortable with things like screenshot captures and audio recording. So this is some of the nuance I was referring to, that there are differing degrees of comfort depending on the type of surveillance tech used. But just stepping back for a moment, what you see here is a great deal of discomfort generally with these methods. Going to the next slide here, there are other interesting kind of facets to this issue. How the company discloses the use of EPST, even if the company discloses its use to employees also has an effect on the comfort level of the people involved. The majority of IT managers, 95%, and nearly as many, 89% of workers, would be more comfortable with their company using this technology if that company were transparent about it. So transparency does matter. But not only would it make them more comfortable, the IT team also is making other assumptions about transparency. They think it would make employees more productive if they knew they were being monitored using EPST. 71% of managers, 69% of workers feel that way. But here, as we say in my business, this is why we do the research, because we're not seeing this level of transparency. 50% of managers instead indicate that their company either never informed employees it was happening, or said this technology was being used, but it wasn't disclosed how it was being used. Let's go to the next slide here, and you'll see there are some pretty strong opinions on this technology. And so we have to ask sort of what action, if any, would the IT team take if their company decided to install this technology or install more of these technologies. And bit of a spoiler alert, it's not good news for company leadership who's advocating that position. This is where it gets kind of even more interesting for me, because resistance to these technologies would not take the form of outright protest, meaning management might not see at the top level people rising up, but the resistance would be there. If you consider that 5% of workers and 8% of managers would flat out refuse to deploy the technology no matter what. That's a small percentage. So what we actually see in the data is companies would be dealing with sort of a stealthier opposition. And here's what that would look like and what that is looking like. More than a quarter of IT workers, so 27%, and a third of IT managers would raise their concerns with leadership before deploying any surveillance tech. So here we have folks sticking up their hands and objecting. But when it comes time, once the objection's been made, to actually implement, here you see folks really dig in. 70% of managers would not force a worker in their department, so an IT worker, to deploy the technology if the worker refused. If and when that worker refuses, a significant percentage of managers would react with what essentially amounts to a slap on the wrist. 45% would say they'd give them a written warning, but then would just assign the task to someone else. And then another 25% would just skip the warning altogether, reassign the task. So right away, we see that managers aren't really looking to make anyone die on that hill. Looking at workers, just to take our opposition analogy a little further, here the insurrection really gets motivated. Nearly 3/4, 73%, in fact, would probably or definitely tell their colleagues the company was using EPST, even if disclosing that information was against policy. So workers are willing to subvert the aim of this technology pretty much from day one, from the get-go. But the guerrilla campaign against surveillance tech wouldn't stop there. Nearly 3/4 of workers, 72%, would tell colleagues about workarounds to the tech. So to me, that is sort of jaw-dropping. As someone who's tasked with managing people, managing things, the expectation that folks are going to follow company policy is sort of integral to companies working well. Here you have, in numerous different ways, managers and workers coordinating with each other to subvert the implementation of this technology. And it really just provides a fascinating overview of how staff can respond to EPST. And it runs that gamut from raising concerns to outright refusing to or otherwise subverting the aims of the tech. So, just think about that at your own companies. If there were a sort of a secret campaign, a whisper campaign to resist a company directive, that shows a lot more than mere concern. It's action that undermines a company policy and investments in technology to support that policy. Going to the next slide here, we'll see that employees must feel very strongly about this issue. So let's get into the repercussions of implementing this tech for the entire company, not just the kind of negative consequences for the IT team. And we can do this by just looking at some statistics amongst companies that are already using this technology. So when asked, both managers and workers alike report increased anxiety, and they report other negative effects like more employees losing trust in company leaders, employees burning out faster, declining morale. It's quite a laundry list of badness there associated with this tech. And so, as you can probably imagine, those consequences make not only for a more challenging work environment, but could have a significant impact on company operations and ultimately the bottom line. So to further illustrate this point, let's just take a moment to pause on the last stat on this slide. So looking over to the far right, and you'll see there that the bars around decreasing productivity. Now, good time to mention, or good time to remind everybody, what the P in EPST stands for. It stands for productivity, right? It's employee productivity surveillance technology. So it's pretty much designed to increase productivity. This has certainly been a major point of emphasis for companies implementing this tech in the COVID and post-COVID era. But as we've seen in this research, it's having the complete opposite effect for a significant number of companies. About a fifth of workers, 20%, and 1/4 of managers, 26%, observed a decrease in productivity since starting to use this technology. So they're directly attributing that decrease to this tech. And to me, that's just stunning. What company would want to launch, implement EPST that has the complete opposite effect for 1/4 of their employees? It's like, who wants to eat a sandwich and feel hungry afterwards? It's kind of the same thing. So that's a very striking result and something that we think is worth remembering. But as we say, the fun doesn't stop there. Going to the next slide here, we see that when a company experiences decreased morale and trust and increased anxiety and burnout, there will be measurable negative impacts on culture and on related topic on employee retention. And that's what we're seeing here. Nearly a third of workers, 29%, and 33% of managers observed declining employee loyalty at their company. Worse, a little less than a third saw more employees quitting since the company started using surveillance technology. And those figures are, again, about the same, 27% of workers, 28% of managers. Even worse, kind of compounding these issues, as more employees are leaving these companies, fewer are coming in the door. So 30% of workers, about a 1/4 of IT managers report it's becoming increasingly difficult to hire new staff. Going to the next slide, we see that the challenges with recruitment and retention also affect the IT department. And here we see yet another manifestation of exactly how much they dislike this technology. More than half of workers, 52%, say they turned down an otherwise desirable IT position if they knew beforehand that the company was using EPST. And so that's quite the scarlet letter for a company to wear as it tries to recruit staff. For 3/4 of IT workers, if the company they currently work for required them to deploy EPST or elements of it that they object to, it would negatively impact their willingness to remain in their current role, 75%. So this includes 30% of folks who begin actively applying for other positions, and 3% who say they would even quit immediately. Now, for that last group, whether they would act on it remains to be seen. But the sentiment is there, and what you see is sentiment. There's enormous emotion behind this issue, and the sum of that emotion is quite honestly just a negative for companies. Going to our next slide here, let's just take a step back and think about what these numbers tell us, because it's a lot of data and it's come at you rather quickly. But what we have is a landscape where we have this EPST technology, a soon to be near ubiquitous technology that appears to be having numerous unintended negative consequences for companies. And while many IT managers and workers believe that the company has the right to use the technology, they don't necessarily believe that right translates into a should, that they don't know if they should be using it. There's a discomfort with its application. How transparent the company is about it can make a difference, for sure. But this tech risks causing anxiety among staff and sowing distrust of company leadership. If you sort of give what you get in an environment where leadership shows very little trust, I think they get very little trust in return. So this technology could actually spur members of the IT team to take matters into their own hands by subverting company policy and telling their colleagues about the use of it and helping them find ways to get around it. So in conclusion, Hannah, if I was in leadership at a company considering using this technology, I would pay very close attention to this research, because the law of unintended consequences is in play. This costly technology could come with costly implications for companies. Hannah?
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. A much better job than I ever could have done going through all of that. So thank you. And I absolutely mirror your sentiment there as far as the final takeaway goes, that you could stick your head in the sand and just think, oh, I'll implement it and it'll be more productive. But who's to say that it's even going to show you really accurate productivity metrics if people are aware and subverting, company policy, for example. So yeah, I think companies and leaders really need to think about how they're going to approach implementing it if they haven't already, and prioritize transparency. So look, thank you so much again for that. What I would say is, for anyone that hasn't read the report, hopefully Nathan here has really piqued your interest, and you're going to head straight over and follow this QR code and download the report yourselves now. You'll also see it doing the rounds on social media. So if you haven't got your phone handy or you missed the code, you'll be able to see it on our LinkedIn, on our Twitter, and everywhere else. Now, you may have remembered at the beginning as well that I said this is part 1. Lucky you're going to have more of me. I'll be back for part 2. And again, you can register ahead of time by following this QR code, and keep an eye out on social again, because we will be doing the rounds for it, and you can register that way. Unfortunately, Nathan won't be with us next time, but hopefully we'll have you on again.
In spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, join in the audience. Put some really difficult questions in.
Yeah, I'm going to ask some very difficult questions.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, I can't wait for that. So if you want to see that happen and me falter over my words, then please do join us. But there we go. That's our summary of part 1 of our webinar series. Thank you so much, Nathan, once again. That was really interesting. And I've been closely aligned to the research, and even I'm listening like, oh yeah, it makes sense. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, take care.